Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I want to talk a little bit about this documentary that I watched recently on the Von Erich family. Of course, the Von Erich family is a famous professional wrestling family coming out of the Dallas Fort Worth area. Basically, they were the premier wrestling family in the 1980s. So much of professional wrestling is generated on second generation wrestlers, third generation wrestlers, even fourth generation wrestlers. But I think there is no other family in the history of professional wrestling that is this prolific and this famous and even this tragic. Some might say that they are the Kennedys of professional wrestling or the Jacksons, as in Michael Jackson's family of professional wrestling, in the sense that their father, Fritz von Erich, aka Jack Atkinson, was so driven by having his sons achieve something that he himself did not achieve. What is the background of this family? Well, Jack Atkinson was born in the 1940s in the town of Jewett, Texas, a small Texas town around Dallas, and he was the son of B.R. Atkinson, a sheriff of the town, and some believe that his grandmother was even the first female uh, mayor of Jewett, Texas. And he went to Southern Methodist University, where he participated in discus throwing as well as football. But because of his getting married to his wife, um, Doris, Southern Methodist University was a Christian university, so they had kind of strict rules as far as um, who could be married and who could be in relationships. Basically, at that time, so he was forced to drop out and forego a football career. From there, he went back to his hometown of Dallas and he got involved with Ed McLemore, who was the local. Ed McLemore was basically the local promoter at the time in Dallas. Um, his show was sometimes called Southwest Wrestling or Texas Wrestling, aka RASSLIN Wrestling. And it was just one of those local shows, local affiliate territories that everybody in wrestling, knows about. Wrestling was divided into several different territories at the time. There wasn't a national promotion. Like if you were in New York, you were under Vince McMahon Sr. If you were in, say, Minneapolis, you were under Vern Gagne. If you were in San Francisco, you were under Roy Shire. If you were in Los Angeles, you were under Mike and Gene LaBelle or Eileen Eaton. Different promoters. There wasn't one national promotion like there is today in the WWE. So in Dallas, it was this guy, Ed McLemore. And in Houston, it was Morris Siegel and then later became Paul Bosch. Houston would become important within this whole story because it was Fritz, when he first expanded out of Dallas, who eventually took over Paul Bosch's territory in Houston and took over Joe Blanchard's territory in San Antonio. His television, his um, world class championship wrestling television, expanded into those specific markets. But during this time in the 50s, when he was still wrestling as Jack Atkinson under his birth name, he didn't develop his gimmick yet. He was just wrestling as himself. Later on, he would move on to other territories, specifically Calgary territory, which was run by Bret Hart's father, was the Stampede Wrestling territory, and it was in this territory that he um, that Stu Hart trained him, really taught him how to really work in the business. But because before, when he was down in Dallas for Ed McLemore, he was just doing basically he was doing jobs. He was an opening match guy. He didn't have no gimmick. He didn't have no flair. He didn't have no character. So when he goes to Calgary, it's Stu Hart that develops him the German character and gives him the claw maneuver, which was his finishing maneuver, and teams him up with his kayfabe or fake brother Waldo von Erich, and they become a tag team, a really formidable tag team. And they even developed this fake backstory within the wrestling magazines that Fritz von Erich, as a youngster during World War II in Germany, actually went against his commanding officer, body slammed his commanding officer, then was kicked out of the German army and vowed to come to America to take uh, the World Heavyweight Championship from all the American wrestlers. This was basically his fake autobiography. And people bought into it because it was right after World War II. The Germans were still a formidable memory in a lot of people's minds. And Fritz wasn't necessarily, um, that great of a wrestler or that great of a promo, but just his presence and his stature and the claw, because he would do the claw and then he would squeeze his opponent's face and blood would just come pouring down his opponent's face as he would squeeze their face. In fact, there is one story where he's wrestling. I believe it's either it's Antonio Inoki or Giant Baba or Ox Baker, one of them, and they go to blade, and by accident they cut Fritz's finger, and Fritz is bleeding out of his finger. You know, obviously wrestlers, as many people know from the Secrets of Pro Wrestling Exposed documentary that came out like in 1998. Um, Wrestlers, when they want to produce color or bleed, they cut themselves on the right eye or somewhere in the eye with a razor blade. You see this in many old school wrestlers like Abdullah the Butcher, for example, or Dusty Rhodes. They have a lot of scar tissue. So anyway, Fritz would do this hold, and the hold became so popular that over time, Fritz von Erich, this German Nazi character, became a babyface, especially when after he left Canada, he wrestled in New York for a while, and like in the upstate New York area for a promoter by the name of um, Pedro Martinez. In the Buffalo area, when that becomes important, when he and Doris have their first child, Jackie, and that child at the age of 7 years old is electrocuted, gets into electrical wires, and is later electrocuted by accident. I think it's either in Buffalo, it's somewhere uh, upstate New York. And Gene Kaninsky, who he was wrestling at the time, Fritz was going for the NWA Heavyweight Championship against Gene, tells him, listen, your son has died. Now, according to what Bill Watts was, I guess, teaming with Fritz at the time. He says that no, Fritz knew about his son, his oldest son Jackie, dying, and he he actually yelled at him and threw him out of the house, and that's why he played in the snow and he got electrocuted. But besides this, the family had already experienced some sorts of tragedy when Doris Atkinson's um, brother died of a brain tumor at the age of 14. So, but as far as the Von Erich kids, this this was the first um, this was the first sort of tragedy that they experienced as far as them. So, long story short, Fritz Von Erich becomes a major attraction in the Dallas area when he comes back. And because of his intellect, he is able to parlay his position as the top babyface because they turn him babyface eventually because he has the match with Gene Kaninsky in 1960 and he almost wins the World Heavyweight Championship. So the crowd is behind him. Plus, he had the feud with Gary Hart, Playboy Gary Hart, a man who grew up in the south side of Chicago, becomes a wrestling manager. And at this time, I think he is managing either the Missouri Mauler or the Von Browers. I think it makes more sense with this story, the Von Browers, because what Gary Hart basically does is he exposes Fritz von Erich as a fraud. Says that Fritz was never born in Berlin, Germany. That he's not even a German. His name is Jack Atkinson, and he and his partner Waldo von Erich is a Canadian. So he basically turning Fritz into a babyface. And on screen, this rivalry between Gary Hart and Fritz von Erich becomes a major theme when Fritz decides to found his own promotion. So Fritz is in Dallas. He's becoming the major babyface because Gary Hart's exposing him, and he's going for the title. So he's like the hometown boy. Now they know he's from Texas. They know he's from Southern Methodist University, and he's like becoming like a Stone Cold Steve Austin character, basically. Stone Cold Steve Austin was a heel, but then through feuding with baby faces, he later became himself a baby face, a good guy. So this is what's happening to Fritz. Behind the scenes, Fritz is also getting involved with the business side of the promotion, helping out Ed McLemore with the accounting and helping him out with putting together the matches and the programs. So there's a shakeup in Texas wrestling, and by the end of the 1960s, both Morris Siegel, who was the owner of the Houston territory, and Ed McLemore, who was the owner of the Dallas territory where Fritz is at, both of them pass away. There was some instances with their main arena, the Sportatorium in the 1950s, that caused them to drop out of the NWA into 1956 when the United States government came after the National Wrestling Alliance and exposed them as a monopoly. They actually sent Hitman out and burned down the Sportatorium. So Ed McLemore was always on the outs with NWA promoters, and that's one of the reasons why the NWA promoters didn't want to put the belt on Fritz von Erich, and he had the AWA championship and the Omaha championship put on him instead. So even though he was getting over a lot with the crowd as a babyface, he still didn't win the championship. So now Ed McLemore dies, and Fritz, as the number one star, as what happened in a lot of these other territories, the number one star would buy into the company and he would become the owner. This is exactly what happened to Bill Watts in the Mid-South territory with Tulsa, Oklahoma, when he took it from Leroy McGurk. Is exactly what happened to in the New York territory when Gorilla Monsoon became a partial owner of it before 1982 when Vince Jr. took it over. It happened in a lot of territories. It happened in San Francisco when Roy Shires took it from Joel Mankiewicz or Malshkowitz, whatever his name is, but the owner of the territory. Basically, the point is the main star will buy into a stake in that territory, and that's what Fritz started to do, and he became the majority owner by the time Ed McLemore dies at the end of the 1960s, going into the 70s. And by 1975, Sam Mushnick, who was the St. Louis promoter, who was the president of the NWA at the founding of the NWA in 1948, he steps down as the president, and Fritz becomes the president in 1975. But the owners of the NWA, they're very concerned that Fritz is going to use his political power as the president of the National Wrestling Alliance to make himself the champion. So they decide to make somebody else the president of the NWA, the booker or the matchmaker for Sam Mushnick, Jim Barnett, who himself actually worked in the administration of President Jimmy Carter, which is an interesting story, and also had some exploits with a famous movie star, Rock Hudson, and is very well known to wrestling fans as being the booker of Georgia Championship Wrestling. And eventually, what they feared Fritz von Erich would do, Jim Barnett actually does when he puts the title on Tommy Rich in 1981. Basically, putting it on your favorite. See, because when Sam Mushnick had it, it was mostly on around the waist of Lou Thesz, and Lou Thesz was an actually classically trained wrestler whose pedigree goes back to a time when professional wrestling was a real sport. So Fritz is maneuvered out as the president of the NWA in 1975, but his territory is in Dallas now that he's taken over is still making a ton of money, and he decides he's going to put his sons involved with the wrestling business. And in 1977, David Von Erich goes for his first NWA World Championship against Harley Race. And they wrestled to a draw, Harley and David, but people are so impressed with David Von Erich. People are saying that David Von Erich is going to be the future of the NWA. That David Von Erich is going to be the one to capture that brass ring and bring home the gold to Dallas and represent Dallas, to the point where they even take David and they shop him out to other territories. They send him down to Florida where he works for Eddie Graham as a heel for a while. And he is really adjusting to it. And like his father, he's using the claw. And like his father, he is over as a babyface. His nickname was, he was the Yellow Rose. He was the Yellow Rose of Texas, right? After the famous song from the Mexican-American War, right? He's representing his state, Texas. And then the other, in 1979, the other boys, Kevin and Kerry get involved. And they are the ones, Gary Hart has taken over as the booker of World Class Championship Wrestling at this time called Southwest Sports. And those guys are lighting the territory on fire. But they don't have anybody, so much to the point that Fritz is able to monopolize and take over the Houston territory from Paul Bosch and try to maneuver his boys into that. And his whole thing throughout the late 70s is trying to politic to get the World Heavyweight Championship on one of his boys. He couldn't get it on himself because, again, they didn't trust him and they felt like he wouldn't be able to really draw a lot of money. Just the same thing with Vern Gagne. That's why Vern Gagne left, bought the Minneapolis territory from Tony Stecker and left the NWA in 1960. And that's really one of the major reasons why Vince McMahon Sr. founded the WWF in 1963 after he left. He took the New York territory and he left also. And he put the belt on Buddy Rogers because they wanted to take, the NWA promoters wanted to take the belt off Buddy Rogers and put it back on Lou Thesz for a third time. And Lou Thesz wasn't drawn in New York. And Vern, he wanted to make himself the champion. So he withdrew from the NWA and created the AWA. But Fritz didn't do that. Fritz wanted to stay within the confines of the NWA. Yes, he had won the AWA title in '63, and he wrestled Vern Gagne, and he won the Omaha title, which was basically like the Missouri State title, a secondary title in the AWA. But when he rejoined when he took over the territory and he rejoined the NWA, he wanted to stay within the NWA and have one of his boys win the NWA championship. He didn't want to create his own promotion like Vince Sr. and Vern Gagne did. He ended up doing it later in 1986, but that's another story. Um, so he's pushing the boys, the three of them, Kerry, Kevin, and David, and they're getting over. And a lot of people say that David Von Erich was the top Von Erich. He had all the essential tools, and he would have won the championship had it not been for his unfortunate accident. Okay, what is that? What was that accident? Well, in 1984, first this Gary Hart takes over as the booker for World Class Championship Wrestling from Red Bastien. I believe in 1981, because that's when they started doing their first Star Wars shows. Um, Gary Hart notices that his son is playing with a lot of Star Wars toys. It's 1981. Empire Strikes Back is a year removed from the time Empire Strikes Back came out in 1980. So Gary Hart is um, very aware that Star Wars is a huge cultural phenomenon. So he has this idea for a super show for World Class Championship Wrestling, and he comes up with Wrestling Star Wars. How, Fritz is concerned that they'll be sued by George Lucas. They never really were. I don't think they were on Lucas's radar at that time. You know what I mean? And the fact that they added Wrestling Star Wars, I think, you know, makes them uh, you know, makes them not liable for a lawsuit on behalf of Lucasfilm. But anyway, he has this idea for a super show, and in that first super show against King Kong Bundy, that was supposedly Fritz Von Erich's last match, because Gary Hart is telling him, listen, you got to retire, because as long as you continue to be in the wrestling business, people are not going to be interested in the boys. You know what I mean? You want them to be interested in Kevin, Kerry, and David, but they're not going to be interested in them, because you know you're still wrestling and you're the most over guy in the whole territory. So finally, in 1981, at the first Wrestling Star Wars show in Texas Stadium, Fritz Von Erich retires against King Kong Bundy. King Kong Bundy actually had hair, and he lost it in that hair match against um, Fritz. But in 1982, Gary Hart has this idea. He says, as good as the Von Erichs are, they have nobody to really go against them as a foil. So in 1980, and we talked about this before in the channel, in 1980, Bill Watts um, got the Fabulous Freebirds from the Memphis territory. They were first in the Mississippi territory under George C. Culkin. Then they moved to Jerry Jarrett, where he really put them together. He really put them together as a package. Michael Hayes, Buddy Roberts, and Terry Gordy, who was like 21 at the time, one of the youngest prodigies in professional wrestling. They did the angle with the Junkyard Dog, where they blinded the Junkyard Dog with Freebird shaving cream, and he wasn't able to see his firstborn his daughter being born. He only had one daughter, but his daughter being born, and that famous story where somebody pulled the gun out on the JYD and said, "Don't worry, I got him, dog," because Junkyard Dog was an African American and he was over in the Mid South area that Bill Watts promoted. Because again, these new promoters are taking over from these old promoters in the '60s. So whereas Leroy McGurk might have pushed Leroy McGurk in the Mid South area might have pushed somebody like Danny Hodge, a junior heavyweight in that territory. Now Bill Watts came back. He was the number one star there. He came back from doing his tour of New York, and he is pushing other different people. And he has Ernie Ladd as his booker. He's pushing the JYD, and he's trying to get the African American audience, on the side of the Mid South, and move the tapings from where they were in Tulsa to Shreveport, Louisiana. And he does. He builds up a lot of African American stars, Dark Journey, Butch Reed, all these other ones, just like what Fritz is doing with his boys in his territory. So anyway, the Freebirds have that tremendous angle. They pack out the Louisiana Superdome in 1980, and they make Junkyard Dog a star. So you know they can make stars out of people. So Gary Hart brings them into the Dallas area. And at first, they come in as friends of the Von Erichs. They come in as buddies of the Von Erichs, as baby faces, right? But they have this show on their world-class television, a match between Kerry Von Erich, because this time David, who they really want to push, Kerry Von Erich, and Ric Flair. And in this, the referee makes a decision and he disqualifies Kerry. So Fritz comes out and Fritz starts complaining and bitching to the referee. So now they have the fans vote on who they want to be the referee, and their choice is Michael Hayes. And this is Christmas of 1982. Keep in mind, I say 1982 is the biggest year in professional wrestling above all across the board, because you have in the Louisiana territory, you have Ted DiBiase's heel turn when he hits Junkyard Dog with the loaded glove. In New York, you have Bob Backlund and Jimmy Snuka, where Jimmy Snuka eventually turns on Captain Lou Albano, and he becomes a babyface. And in '83, jumps off the cage in Madison Square Garden. And in the Dallas area, you have this. Storyline with Michael Hayes as the referee. So Michael Hayes is the referee. Kerry Von Erich's about to win. He's about to win. And then he gets into a shoving match with Ric Flair. He knocks Ric Flair out. And there, Kerry has the chance. And of course, in the southern cage matches, in the southern territories, it's not like in New York. See, in New York, in the WWF or the WWF, because Bruno Sammartino never liked the fence cages, they always had the big blue cage. And that started in the 60s when he was wrestling against the original Sheik. And the rules in New York were the first one who makes it out of the cage and their feet touches their both feet touch the ground, they win. In the South, it was never like that. Pinfalls counted, submissions counted in the cage matches. So Kerry Von Erich has Flair laid out, but Kerry, being that he's a Christian, because one of the things I forgot to mention was that after Fritz's first son dies, he converts to Christianity, and the Christian Broadcasting Network under Pat Robertson picks up World Class's production. So the characters of the Von Erichs, they flaunt their Christian faith. They're very Pentecostalish. They're very religious. So being as they're good Christians within the storyline, even though the Freebirds are their friends, they cannot, Kerry cannot cheat and he cannot cheat and cover Ric Flair and win the championship, because that's cheating. He cannot accept a dirty win. He has to do it the fair way. So he pushes Michael Hayes, and Michael Hayes push him. He gets pushed out of the cage, and then long story short, Michael Hayes slams the cage door in Kerry's face, and boom, the Freebirds turn heel, and then begins the greatest piece of business that World Class had ever seen for the next 2 years. and that's the feud between the Freebirds and the Von Erichs. And it was a feud, but like a feud between different states, because here the Freebirds, they come out with the Confederate flag, they represent Georgia, they represent their home team, home state, homestead, and they're the bad boys. They drinking whiskey, they're cussing, they're outlaws basically. And the Von Erichs were these good old wholesome Christian boys, coming from this wholesome Christian family. There was even a magazine cover at the time on Pro Wrestling Illustrated with Michael Hayes with a with a Southern Comfort whiskey and Kerry Von Erich with a glass of milk. So the juxtaposition of the goody two shoes Von Erichs and the bad boys, the fabulous Freebirds. So they start selling out all the whole territory. They go to Reunion Arena. They start selling out Texas Stadium. They have big time Cotton Bowl shows. These Star Wars shows, they blow up. But in the midst of that, David Von Erich, who's touring Japan at the time, passes away. And this was like 1984. And you can watch this show on the WWE Network. It is so sad and somber because even the heels, even the people that he wrestled matches against, like Harley Race and Ric Flair and the Freebirds, even in the midst of their feud, even Michael Hayes has to acknowledge that, that David Von Erich, has passed away in real life. You know what I mean? So it is really sad, being that it's wrestling and people know it's a work. Even back then, people knew it was fake. But this guy really died. He supposedly died of, he had eaten something and he failed to regurgitate. But there's more to it. Most in the wrestling community believe that he had actually passed away from a drug overdose in Japan, because there are stories of Bruiser Brody flushing copious amounts of drugs down the toilet in David Von Erich's hotel room. But Fritz, he does some PR shit and he covers it up. And throughout the whole thing, you can see Fritz, doing a sit-down interview with his family, saying basically that, David was a good guy. Can't believe this happened to David. And then Mike, the other son, will be the next David Von Erich. They're saying, oh, doesn't Mike look a lot like David? Doesn't he? Like really pushing Mike, who didn't want to be in the wrestling business to begin with, who wanted to be a guitarist, as the next David Von Erich. You know what I mean? So it's sad, but it's weird. And at the end of it, and this is 1984, Ric Flair, the NWA Championship, loses to Kerry Von Erich, and Kerry Von Erich wins the NWA Championship for the first and only time. And the Cotton Bowl, the Texas Stadium goes crazy. Man, it's one of the most historic moments, and he did it with a backdrop. And one of the reasons Ric Flair said he did it with his backdrop was because Kerry Von Erich was always messed up on drugs